Hello and welcome to Jesuitical, a podcast from American Media for saints and sinners. You can join us each week for honest conversations about the Catholic Church and our world today, sometimes over drinks. I'm Ashley McKinless, and I'm joined by Sebastian Gomes.
Is January over yet?
Not yet.
I'm just kidding. I'm doing really well in my dry
good.
January.
You look well.
Yeah, no, it's going really, really well. Unfortunately, I feel like it's my job to fill in, and I have nothing. So we're being extra ascetic today and not drinking anything.
Yeah, I do have a seltzer water, but if it's off screen.
Canada Dry, right? Your favorite?
Just like you, Canada Dry.
Oh man, that's bad. But I feel like I'm channeling my inner Gen Zer because if I've read correctly, like the youngsters aren't drinking anymore.
No, it's true. It's an interesting phenomenon. They're not doing much anymore. They're not driving, not leaving the house. Just kidding. We love you, Gen Z. You're doing great.
Luckily, we're a show for millennials.
Yes. All right, and we have a great show today. We've got a life episode, and of course, in the Catholic Church, life is not only about abortion, but that's obviously one of the focuses this week because this Friday is the 53rd annual March for Life. But we're also talking to our guest Charles Camosy about his new book on euthanasia. It's called "Living and Dying Well: A Catholic Plan for Resisting Physician-Assisted Killing."
Yeah, that's right. And so the main part of the show will be our interview, which we did a couple of months ago, which looks at his book and talks about euthanasia in Canada and the United States and other Western countries. Deeply concerning, but also deeply enlightening. But in the first part of our show, we're actually talking about the march and particularly the pro-life movement and where it's at today. Obviously, everybody associates the pro-life movement with advocacy against abortion. And we know in 2022, the constitutional right to an abortion was overturned. So we wanted to bring Charlie on to kind of give us an update on where that movement, that advocacy movement stands here at the beginning of 2026. But I did want to say I really appreciate Charlie's perspective. He's a very good writer, but he really is helpful in complicating the narrative around some of these hot button issues, which tend to just polarize people and kind of harden them in their own positions. And, he approaches it like, no, there's more than just, I'm right and you're wrong in the conversation. There has to be moments of encounter, moments of dialogue, moments of deeper kind of understanding of the issues at their core. And I just find it enormously enlightening, enormously helpful. I always learn something new about these life issues when I read Charlie or we talk to him.
Yep. So stick around for those two conversations with Charlie. But first, I did want to bring one really important Catholic news story from the long weekend. So on Monday, 3 U.S. Cardinals, Blaise Cupich of Chicago, Robert McElroy of Washington, D.C., and Joseph Tobin of Newark, released this really rare joint statement calling for, quote, the establishment of a genuinely moral foreign policy for our nation. So the statement does not name Trump specifically, but it points to what's happening in Venezuela, Ukraine, and Greenland, which they say, quote, have raised basic questions about the use of military force and the meaning of peace. And so this statement from the Cardinals comes in the wake of Pope Leo's major foreign policy address, where he warned diplomats at the Vatican that, quote, a zeal for war is spreading, and he described what would be a real moral foundation for a just international order. So these 3 U.S. Cardinals were picking up on that and reiterating it in the context of the United States today. So we have more coverage of this story at americamagazine.org, and they will be covering it this week on Inside the Vatican, so you can learn more there.
That's right. And now here's our conversation, part 1 with Charles Camosy.
All right, and joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Charles Camosy is Charlie. Welcome back to Jesuitical.
Hey, it's great to be with you again.
So we are talking during the week of the March for Life. On Friday, when this episode drops, it will be the 53rd annual March for Life in Washington, D.C. So we wanted to have you on to talk about how the pro-life movement has changed since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, which was kind of the origin of this march. So I think it's an interesting question to know, what's the purpose of the march today, now that Roe v. Wade does not exist on the books anymore?
Yeah. So, Charlie, the conversation that we have with you focuses on euthanasia, assisted killing, in the interview coming up. But obviously, as Ashley's alluding to, the question of abortion is central to the pro-life movement. It always has, and it is at the heart of this question of Roe versus Wade, and which was overturned in 2022. So, could we start just by laying out some context, like what has happened in the United States since the overturning of Roe in 2022?
Well, first of all, just at a very basic level, the states now are the primary, if you want to say, battlegrounds for restricting abortion, and if you want to also talk about supporting women, which I think we should. But with regard to the straight up no chaser restrictions of abortion, it's a state battle now. And as you may know, and many of your listeners may know, there's been some very significant good news. States like Louisiana, Texas, Florida are protecting prenatal justice in profound ways, restricting most abortions. In more cases, however, there's a lot that's concerning. Most states that have had ballot initiatives, for instance, have overwhelmingly decided to protect, if not expand, abortion rights. States that already had very open laws with regard to abortion are making them even more open. There's just been a general sense, I think it's fair to say, there's a kind of crossroads that we're at as I think it's better to say pro-life movements rather than one pro-life movement.
And some of the states where they had these referendums were pretty conservative states, and still uh, did not go down the path of banning abortions for the most part. Did that come as a surprise to you in places like
Yes,
Kansas?
yeah, it did. And I think it was a surprise for almost everyone, I think. I don't think there were a lot of pro-choice people that were expecting Kansas to go first and to go for abortion. Later, Ohio, as you mentioned, a number of states that, if we have to characterize them, would be red states, or it's not clear what it means to be conservative these days anymore. But certainly that's the reputation they have. It was always maybe a little bit of a tension, though, because a number of these conservative states had very much libertarian leanings, in the sense that we don't want government sort of interfering with us. People should be able to make up their own minds without government interference. And those have proved to be powerful arguments, even in those, like you said, very conservative or red states.
It's so interesting that the same dynamic plays out in the Catholic Church as well. Like, I don't have the latest numbers at my fingertips, but I think in general, a majority of Catholics in the United States support the right under some circumstances for an abortion, but also a majority of Catholics recognize that abortion is morally illicit, right? So that's a kind of a tension, right? So I always found it fascinating with this debate about Roe and the constitutional right to an abortion, that as much as strong as the advocacy was among the movements, as you say, to overturn it, the simple fact of overturning it doesn't necessarily accomplish the goal that you're looking for. There's like a deeper conversion process conversation that has to happen that seems to be much more kind of granular, one-on-one, but also complicated.
That's true. I think we should also just put out there that opponents of pro-lifers on these questions were much better organized, much better funded, had a largely compliant media. Even people I've known who've had me on interviews at Fox News will say even Fox News producers are generally pro-choice. It's very difficult, actually, to find a way to have just a meaningful conversation about abortion since the backlash to Dobbs and the overturning of Roe versus Wade took place. And again, like places like Montana, we mentioned, lost a ballot initiative. I was out there very recently talking to people, and they said, we were just outspent so dramatically. We just basically didn't have a chance to counter the kind of money that was being put into this. And so there are mistakes that have been made, and we weren't ready. And I think there are political reasons why it hasn't been as successful as we might otherwise have hoped. But a big part of this is we're really fighting a massive, well-funded machine here too.
Yeah. So, how do you see the pro-life movement adapting? As you mentioned, you were surprised, and basically everyone was surprised at their failure in certain red states. So, just tactically or strategically, have they adapted, and have you seen any places where they're having some gains?
I guess maybe even very recently is the first time I've really seen an attempt to kind of push back on, for instance, a Trump administration, which has been largely, well, I don't know if you could say it's largely anything because it's very much like a chameleon. It changes almost week to week and what it stands for. But for instance, the kind of pushback we've seen to make sure the Hyde Amendment was applied, no federal money for abortion was applied to the healthcare subsidies that it looks like many are trying to get brought back for Obamacare here. There was actually some pushback, and people said, hey, we're not going to stand for this. This is not who we are. This is the bare minimum. If you're not doing this, you won't get our support. I think that's a hopeful green shoot.
And this was after President Trump told Republican lawmakers to be, quote unquote, flexible when it comes to the Hyde Amendment in their negotiations over these healthcare subsidies. So that was kind of what sparked this, significant pushback from the pro-life movement to the Trump administration, which, has claimed to be the most pro-life presidency in U.S. history, was responsible for getting the judges that overturned Roe v. Wade. But then, as you said, with Trump, there's it's always complicated and it's hard to know where he's going to go on things like this.
Yeah, and the victory over Roe is a real victory, and there are states now that are protecting prenatal justice that weren't allowed to before. But let's just deal with reality. The number of abortions, especially because of the ubiquity of the abortion pill, are up dramatically since Roe versus Wade was overturned, not down.
Did that surprise you?
Yes and no. I guess it did surprise me a little bit, but especially as I saw the various states protect abortion. We have now a situation where about 60% of all abortions are from a pill that can easily be sent through the mail that doesn't take going to a Planned Parenthood clinic. It's good. Some Planned Parenthood clinics are closing. Some people might point to that as a good thing, and to a certain extent it is. But if you look at it a different way, you can look at it just as the market speaking, right? More people want to have abortions via these pills than they do want to have a surgical abortion in a Planned Parenthood clinic. And so while there are some Planned Parenthood clinics closing, that's good. The fact that we're having more abortions is obviously terrible. The fact that more and more women are being coerced into having, sometimes physically coerced or via trick coerced into taking an abortion drug. Somebody puts it in their drink, or the threat of intimate partner violence forces them to take it. These are terrible things, obviously, too. And there really doesn't seem to be a strategy, especially as the administration, which says it's our friends, it's our friend in all this, not only has punted on Hyde or tried to punt on Hyde, has not done the abortion pill study they promised us to do. One of the big reasons that abortion pills are so terrible, in addition to killing babies, is because they're really terrible for women, or at least there's lots of evidence to suggest they're really terrible for women. We need to do the studies to show whether that the indications are true or not. This administration promised to do it. They have not done it. Another thing is apparently Planned Parenthood got its money back after being defunded somehow. I don't know all the ins and outs of that. I'm not a perfect expert when it comes to these questions. Seems to be a problem for the most pro-life administration ever. And then IVF, one of the most dramatic examples of a practice that discards prenatal human beings, puts them in frozen prisons, is obviously inconsistent with a vision that protects prenatal justice.
And what has the Trump administration said about IVF?
It's been explicitly in favor of IVF, right? Like, this is something we ought to support, trying to get more money for IVF, not even really considering it to be a controversial issue. And there are, in some ways, it is not totally a Catholic Protestant thing, but there are pro-lifers, many of whom are Catholic, that think differently about IVF than maybe some other Protestant pro-lifers do. So there are differences there in certain ways and circumstances. But at the very least, I think it's important to say that after Dobbs, after Roe was overturned, this administration basically thought it had done what it needed to do. The sort of deal that was struck was fulfilled, and there isn't really a lot of feeling that they need to do much else.
That's interesting. Obviously, like our conversations with you, this one, and then the one that our listeners will hear about your book on euthanasia, testifies to the fact that abortion is not the only issue, obviously, within the pro-life movement. So I wanted to ask you a general question, again, kind of about the state of the movements today. But considering there are so many sort of pressing issues that we're facing, that we're talking about almost daily, it seems, in the news. Thinking about immigration, for example, in this country. And then I was also thinking, because in the months since we last talked to you, Pope Leo actually was interviewed briefly about, asked about a specific case, which we don't need to get into. But in a nutshell, he articulated Catholic social teaching, which is that, human dignity is broad, inclusive. And so, for example, someone who is against abortion should also be concerned for an immigrant. So I wonder if you could just comment on the state of the pro-life movement in its expansive form, that's not just focusing on abortion, what you're seeing in terms of trends and how it's developing.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say with any authority about what's happening. It's more anecdotal experience. I think there is a bifurcation happening, though, at least again from my own experience, where there's a group of pro-lifers who are going more hardcore on abortion, even calling themselves, and I do support the abolition of abortion, but referring to themselves as abolitionists. They don't even really like to call themselves pro-life because of almost in light of what you just said, right? Because the pro-life commitment has obviously some kind of commitments beyond abortion. So they refer to themselves as abortion abolitionists. And it's not a super big group yet, but it's very energetic and it gets a lot of headlines. It's actually behind a lot of what has been happening in some states to try to get women punished for abortions, because they see that as the only way to really help people understand what's actually happening in abortion, to treat it like it's a kind of murder. I do think, though, there's a bigger range and broader range of people in the movement who understand that they need to have a broad vision if they're going to win over the U.S. American people on these questions. They absolutely have to be able to have a broader vision that can't be just limited to abortion. You have to find a way to engage with people who disagree with you on the merits of your principles and say, are you for nonviolence? Are you for the flourishing of women? Are you for giving voice to the voiceless? Are you against ableism and violence against disabled populations? Yeah. Are you for welcoming the stranger, welcoming people whose dignity you might find inconvenient? And make common cause and say, yeah, this has implications when it comes to ecological concern. This has implications when it comes to labor. It has implications for abortion. It has implications for physician-assisted killing. It has implications for the death penalty. It has implications for warfare and how we treat especially innocent civilians in war. And so it's not this thing that people can isolate as sort of a pet project of a few that have sold out to the Trump administration or something. What it really is the vision of Pope Leo, the vision of Pope Francis, the vision of Pope Benedict XVI, the vision of every single pope that has been pope in a time where these are issues. And to say that it isn't just could be easily refuted by the kinds of documents they write and continue to write. And happily, Pope Leo continues in that tradition.
So it's been maybe difficult is the right word, 4 years for the pro-life movement. There was this euphoria after Roe v. Wade was overturned, and then these legislative defeats in different states. But the pro-life movement has been nothing if not persistent. There were years when they didn't think they'd ever overturn Roe v. Wade, and now they have more challenges in 50 states. So I'm curious, kind of, what positive signs you're seeing, signs of hope for what might come next for the movement.
I guess I'd say two things. One is at the end of life, though we still have some difficulties, and we'll be saying more about that in the next section of what we're going to talk about here, the next session. There have been some very significant victories and continued victories. So Connecticut, for instance, a deep blue state, has continued to ban physician-assisted killing for 13 or 14 years in a row, something like that. Massachusetts still continues to ban it. Minnesota still continues to ban it. Maryland still continues to ban it. It's a bipartisan thing in many cases. That's not true necessarily with regard to abortion, but I guess the other positive thing I would mention here is that at least there seems to be some evidence that younger people, especially young Gen Z, are more open to religious thoughts, religious ideas, than we might have suspected. In fact, it looks like young Gen Z is with in comparison to older Gen Z is more religious, goes to church more frequently. And, it's not directly about abortion, obviously, but if you can help people get that vision we talked about, that Pope Leo, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope St. John Paul II vision, then that's something you can work with, right? That is something that you can build on. That's something that could be a salt and light in a culture that finds it difficult to do this. And I guess I'll just finish by saying I don't know how much worse it can get. At a certain point, you just got to think that maybe we'll balance this out here.
All right. Well, we'll leave the conversation there for now. So we're just going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Charles Camosy to dive deeper into the challenge that euthanasia is posing across the Western world in particular. So stay with us.
Joining us from outside of Point Pleasant, New Jersey, is Charles Camosy. Charlie teaches moral theology and bioethics at the Catholic University of America. He's the author of 10 books, including Living and Dying Well, a Catholic plan for resisting physician-assisted killing. Welcome to Jesuitical, Charlie.
Thank you. And it's great to be with you on a morning. I know you guys are being flexible by joining me here. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
It's great to have you. So this is a big and complicated and difficult to discuss topic. And you make the case in your book that it's a really important topic to talk about right now, that we're at a tipping point in the culture and especially in the Western developed world when it comes to the acceptance and advocacy of physician-assisted killing. So can you kind of just paint a picture of where we are in terms of the law in the United States and, I guess, public opinion when it comes to physician-assisted killing?
Yeah, I think it's easier to talk about the law, frankly, than it is about public opinion. So let me start there and then try to transition to public opinion. We just seem to be at a huge tipping point here, a kind of, which way are we going to go on this type question? And I think by looking even at blue states in the United States in particular, or states that lean progressive to the extent that that category means anything, we have just a wild differentiation between how this is adjudicated in law. So Oregon led the charge, so to speak, back in the 90s by legalizing it, and Washington State soon followed after that. My home state of New Jersey passed it a few years ago, but other more progressive deep blue states have rejected it. Connecticut has rejected it 14 years in a row, I believe. Maryland, I think 13. Just this past few months, deep blue states in the Midwest like Illinois, Minnesota have rejected it. So it's made progress in some states, others not. It doesn't seem to fit along the right-left sort of binary antagonistic, progressive versus conservative mindset. It hasn't really been coded that way yet. Not really anyway, I don't think.
What's your sense of why that is? Sorry to interrupt you, but I just
No,
think
that's fine.
it is one of those issues, and your book kind of brings this out. It's like right near the beginning. It's one of these sort of myth busting things, but it's a topic, it's an issue that doesn't kind of neatly fall into our political categories, which it seems like in our culture we're always, very ready to do, and we're looking to categorize and catalog and stuff like that. And this doesn't. So, in some of these blue states, like what do you think the reason for that is? Are there like healthy conversations happening across the aisle with different groups of people, different advocate groups, or people who are worried about this trend more broadly? Like, why are people finding some consensus and saying, no, this is a dangerous path?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks to America for being an important voice to resist in these particular ways as well. So I just wanted to give a well-deserved shout out to you guys, men in the gender inclusive sense, of course. It's multiple reasons, but I think the main driver is a concern for disability rights, and disability rights activists who seem to be, in my anecdotal experience anyway, the leaders of the resistance in these deep blue states. So when a person wheels herself up in her wheelchair and says, the reasons why people are requesting this are related to my very existence and whether my very existence is deemed worthy of life by the culture, that tends to land in a way that, frankly, pro-life theologian, presenting at the same table might not, and often does not.
So just to be clear on that, so there, like in states, for example, or countries where euthanasia is permitted, we're starting to see more and more of a trend of people who are asking for it, requesting it when they become physically disabled. So they might still be sort of cognizant, or their death might not be kind of imminent, but we're seeing more and more requests like that. And then you have people with disabilities or advocates for people with disabilities saying, whoa, 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 like we're living our best life, trying to live our best lives here in a very difficult situation, and we need help with that. But these other people over here are trying to kill themselves for just living a life that we have already had to live with.
Totally.
Okay.
If you have something, and this almost always happens if you have something less than a straight up no chaser law that says, hey, do whatever you want, kill yourself for whatever reason you want. As soon as you start picking reasons, the reasons why people in Oregon request it are directly relevant to the disability rights movement. So the number one reason is not even, actual loss of autonomy, but fear of loss of autonomy, fear of being a burden on others, fear of loss of enjoyable activities. At least in my study of this, physical pain doesn't even make the top 5 reasons. It's certainly not a major reason why people get this, though that's sort of in the popular culture of this. Brittany Maynard, the famous case, California woman who had to go to Oregon to get a physician-assisted killing. Almost everyone understands why it's important to be sympathetic for someone with a brain tumor and the kind of difficult death that often results in. But those aren't the cases that drive the demand for assisted killing. And so disability rights group rightly say, hey, we've lost these enjoyable activities or never had access to them. We are certainly not autonomous in the way that the Western individualist myth proclaims. We are, quote unquote, burdens on others. But our lives matter. Our lives are dignified. It's not the case that we can sort of understand why you'd want to kill yourself, which is when, going back to my original point, as soon as you start naming reasons why we could sort of understand why it would be good that you'd want to kill yourself, we devalue those lives. And that's what the powerful witness of disability rights groups and disabled persons themselves has been so powerful.
When you're describing the culture in which this is happening, the word you land on is most repeatedly in the book is consumerist, which I thought was interesting. Like you could say secular or post-Christian or any given adjective, but consumerist and throwaway culture is how you describe what's going on here. So why is that?
Well, the assumptions built into some of those reasons why certain populations in Oregon and other studies, including overseas, have confirmed the basic findings in Oregon, are, in my view, directly related to a consumerist throwaway culture that Pope Francis has, had for a long time. Highlighted throws people away, not just garbage or trash, but turns people into things that, under a consumerist lens, are inefficient, burdensome, absolutely loathe the phrase productive member of society. How often do we hear the phrase productive member of society? These are all images, words, concepts that to me invoke a consumerist throwaway culture. And so people who are at risk for physician assisted killing live in such a culture and imagine their value coming from the kind of values that such a culture promulgates, shapes, and from a different angle. I was helping teach a moral theology course for young novitiates for the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal in Newark, and I was at their friary, and we were sort of going through some of this stuff before the book came out. And they were also saying that the reasons why these folks were giving, the reasons these folks were giving for why they wanted to kill themselves sounded suspiciously like their own lives too, as friars, right? Like they lost their autonomy, they lost the kind of enjoyable activities that the culture would consider, but their lives are some of the most joyful, some of the most beautiful. Obviously, disabled persons lead, despite some significant challenges we shouldn't pass by, but are also deeply joyful, deeply meaningful lives. But it's interesting that both of those groups, the friars and the communities of disabled people that I know anyway, their very lives resist the kind of consumerist throwaway culture model as what's valuable.
So we talked a little bit about the situation in the United States, and I'm actually a Canadian citizen, so north of the border, where the state of the euthanasia industry, or however you want to call it, is much more advanced. So I wonder if you could just kind of paint us a picture of what has happened in Canada over the last several decades, but particularly the last 10 years, in terms of like how this was first kind of, you know, cataloged by law and then has sort of opened up to more and more different people over these years who have access to it.
Yeah, so Canada is a very instructive case here. The United States has had a really interesting political dynamic at work, not beyond the one we just articulated, which is important, but also Compassion Choices is very, very smart in how they are advocating for this in the United States. They basically don't allow states to kind of expand physician assisted killing in ways that would sort of set off alarm bells the way they have in Canada. In fact, Canada has not had that situation. Canada has started out small, very similar to the kind of got to be dying within 6 months. But actually, I think Canada is more intellectually honest and consistent in saying, well, who are we to really judge what are good and bad reasons why people would want to kill themselves? With the result that in a very short period of time, a decade or so, and again, Oregon has had it since the 90s and not really expanded it much at all. Canada, quite the opposite. Now, 1 in 20 people in Canada die by physician-assisted killing. There was just a beautifully reported anyway, Atlantic article detailing some of these things in the last month or so.
And I think globally, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but just another statistic that's interesting. I think globally, the country has the second highest like deaths per capita by assisted suicide or
that
assisted killing.
that sounds right to me, and maybe the Netherlands would be slightly higher, but they've also had it since the 90s or even 80s, depending how you measure when it became legal there. So Canada's had, they're going wee down the slide, right? They're on a slippery slope, but it's a slope that so many of us have pointed out for decades now. In bioethics, we sometimes talk about the right to die becoming the duty to die, and that seems to be something similar to what's going on in Canada here. I mean, there's just numerous examples one can point to, but one of the most disturbing ones, and it gets to deep questions of social justice, especially for the most vulnerable, the poor. It's interesting to point out that there are exceptions, but the most aggressive supporters of physician-assisted killing tend to be economically privileged people. We talk more about why that's the case, but the case I point to again and again as a sort of paradigmatic example of what's happening in Canada is the case of a woman who was in public housing. She was economically vulnerable and had public housing, and to Canada's credit, they offered her that public housing. But something was going on with the paint or some other environmental factor in the apartment where she was just having these terrible, horrible reactions to it. And she basically told the housing authority, I can't live in this place, right? This is intolerable for me to live here. I need to be in some other place. And she wasn't offered a new place, but the medical system there did offer her physician-assisted killing as a kind of response to this. Like, listen, if you're forced to live in this terrible situation, you prefer to end your life, we'll give that to you. I mean, the idea that's, this euphemism that gets thrown around, medical aid in dying, the idea that it's a classic example of throwaway culture too, where we change the language to make people like her easier to discard. Um, the idea that somehow this is aiding in her dying is just so obviously, I was going to use a very strong word here, probably shouldn't use, wrong, incorrect, and also really doesn't, and really hides sort of what's happening here in a way that I think is instructive. Um, but what's so interesting too about this is that the law has helped shape the culture, public opinion. So, in a recent poll, 18 to 34-year-old Canadians were the age group most likely to answer that poverty could be a legitimate reason for physician assisted killing. 41%. 4 in 10 18 to 34-year-olds in Canada think that poverty would be a legitimate reason to request and receive physician assisted killing. 60% of young people in that age also thought that disability would be a legitimate reason for it. And they've slid into those very obvious questions. There is a public debate in Canada about whether mental illness as a kind of disability would be a good enough reason to kill yourself, but and there's honest and forthright debate about that. And I hope obviously that attempt to expand it loses. But in my view, Canada, and I'll finish with this. Sorry for the overly long answer, but um, I really hope I hope this doesn't happen. But I think Canada is on the slope of just applying this consistently all the way down to basically saying, "Hey, your life is your life, your body is your body, your death is your death, and who is the state to really tell you who you can contract with to end that life and get the kind of death you desire?"
Yeah, you talk about it being kind of like gruesomely consistent in the way they talk about it. But and you mentioned how the law can kind of shape public opinion in this direction. But you'd mentioned in your book, like if most people, if you saw someone on a bridge about to jump and kill themselves, would restrain them. So there is humans instinctively know that dying by suicide is a tragic thing to be avoided. So how I'm just curious, like how that gets, I don't know, numbed in a case like Canada where it's become so prevalent. And there are stories like the one you told of people doing it for poverty or, yeah, lack of social support.
Yeah, it's a puzzle, isn't it? If you just type something into Google that mentions the word suicide, an 800 number pops up that basically says, "Hey, if you're thinking about killing yourself, call this number," right? Though interestingly, in Canada, some of those 800 numbers, I don't know what those public numbers for public services are starting to recommend assisted suicide to people who call the number. But at least in the United States, the obvious presumption is that somebody's life is worth living. It's good. It's good without remainder. That it's not accidental traits like being a burden on others or enjoyable activities or relative place in your life plan. Those aren't good reasons to kill yourself. And we believe that so strongly that, as you mentioned, people are willing to literally wrap their bodies around people on bridges. So that they don't jump, right? To totally override their autonomous decision, right? With their own physical force. And those things are celebrated, right? You put those pictures up on social media, they get millions of views, hundreds of thousands of likes. I mean, they're just, and they're beautiful images. I mean, I have seen several of them, and that's been the experience. There's almost no one in the comments or in the replies that says, "How dare you impose your view of what's a good life onto that person? Let them jump." Um, and as far as trying to make sense of it, um, I think it gets back to the question you asked me earlier about disability rights folks and why they're so activated here based on the assumptions. I think if they knew more about their story, right? If we look at somebody and we see, well, that person could be like me, or that person is able bodied, or that person we're just going to presume has a life worth living. Therefore, let's take out my belt and wrap them around their body so they can't jump off a bridge. But if we could, if the ableist, consumerist, throwaway culture assumptions get a chance to be part of the equation, again, pure speculation. I just wonder if that's part of what's going on.
Hmm. We've talked a little bit about some of the groups that are opposed to this, and obviously the Catholic Church strongly opposed to it. They've been totally clear on that. The bishops' conferences and Catholics like yourself who have done really good work to try to bring this conversation into the mainstream. But thinking about, some of these complex cases, like the one that you mentioned in Canada with the woman who's living in, a very precarious kind of environmental, you know, apartment that was like unfeasible and then was presented assisted dying or assisted killing. So I'm trying to wrap my head around who exactly are the advocates for this. Like, are there people and maybe industry, maybe is the right word, who would look at a case like that and just say, yeah, no, this makes perfect sense that a person like that would want to kill themselves? Or is there more nuance to it than that?
Well, I guess a critic could say, Charlie, you're cherry picking these extreme examples to try to undermine a broader concern, which is, again, we kind of imagine, at least I think we do as a culture, the kind of Brittany Maynard type situation where you have, a brain tumor and you're facing a painful death, and who wouldn't have some kind of sympathy for such a person, right? Um, but I think we just need to face the facts that have come up again and again, that that's just not what drives physician assisted killing. We need to focus on people who have pain, and the church does, and the church's institutions do. It's interesting to note that there is some evidence to show that countries and polities that adopt physician assisted killing get worse, not better, at palliative care for reasons that aren't too difficult to speculate about. But let me just give you another case, maybe even less, in some ways more dramatic, but in other ways less dramatic case. This is also from didn't appear in my book. It appeared in this really good Atlantic article, which I commend to your listeners. Um, there was a elderly woman who fractured her hip, which happens a lot. And she was told and understood the rest of her life would become weaker. She'd have more falls. And she said, I just don't want that life. I don't want a life of becoming weaker and having more falls. And then she wanted a particular kind of bed and a particular kind of unit. And they said, we don't have a bed for you. And the woman just requested MAID as so-called medical aid in dying, right? As a on the basis of quote unquote frailty in this context. And she was approved, and she got it, and she was assisted in her death. I think when a physician cooperates with that kind of act, I think it's better to call it killing than a suicide. I think something has gone wrong in the very notion of what it means to be a provider of healthcare. Um, Something fundamentally is totally misaligned. And happily, in the United States, we've seen the American Medical Association, very secular organization, again, to just complexify this issue and show how it's not particularly coded in a way we might think. The American Medical Association has had a really robust critique of assisted killing as part of its official policy for years now. And despite compassionate choices and well-moneyed interests trying to change it, and the delegates voted yet again on this. It seems to happen every year or two. And they overwhelmingly defeated the attempt to change the AMA's position, which is basically it undermines the very nature of what it means to do healthcare. To do something like this isn't healthcare, and we are healthcare providers. We're not sort of purveyors of Burger King style medicine where you just get it your way. If we just have a kind of market transaction here. No, we're professionals. We're delivering something that is an ends based practice, and the end of our practice is health, and it's nonviolence, and it's care for the most vulnerable, and saying it's good that you exist. And this totally undermines that. You could pick the dramatic examples and say that's not reflective, but I think the other examples really get to the heart of this, which is at a very broad level, the practice undermines the very nature of practicing healthcare in itself.
The Atlantic article that you mentioned, it features this conference in Canada where a bunch of doctors who administer uh, physician-assisted killing, get together like you would see any other group in a Marriott hotel room to talk about the state of their industry. And I remember one of them talking about it. Like he used to he used to deliver babies, and now he administers aid in dying, physician assisted killing. And he talks about it as like a different kind of delivery, delivering someone to death. And they just talk about it being meaningful and like, I don't know, almost talking about it in spiritual terms. Um, and so I just trying to like wrap my head around the mindset of that, because I think a lot of well-meaning people like hear the cases where there is extreme suffering, and they think, okay, the compassionate thing to do uh, is to let them make this choice. How do you know, counter what is for people maybe very genuine compassion and concern about people who are requesting this?
Yeah, I think, and I forgot to answer your question about public opinion right at the beginning. I think the reason why public opinion, at least at a surface level, is generally supportive of something like a physician assisted killing is because we all have I think, hopefully, if we're not psychopaths, a general sense of compassion for people who are in these difficult states. I just lost my own father July 31st, and it was a pretty difficult death. And my siblings and my mother and I were around for the last several days of his hospice care, and when it's your own parent, it comes home to you, and it's pretty surreal actually to go through that as you're trying to promote a book like this that you just put out. But it was a lot of what I wrote about was on full display here. I mean, this was a sacred moment. This was a very difficult moment. It was a moment of extreme emotion and the kind of care that was necessary to address the physical pain he was feeling was pretty extreme, and we were involved in it actually. All three of his kids were like physically putting morphine in his mouth for the last several days because he really couldn't swallow. And so I get how somebody working in these end of life spaces might in a different way, right, aiming at death rather than what we were doing. And of course, and this is maybe an important point to emphasize, um, giving someone enough um, pain medication to control their pain, um, while foreseeing but not intending this could speed up their death, is perfectly legitimate under Catholic teaching, a pro-life ethic using the principle of double effect. And almost every uh, good hospice that I know that follows the church's pro-life views on this question does what's necessary to control pain. And that's what we did with my own father in hospice. I was for 14 years teaching at Fordham University, and I would teach uh, a service learning bioethics class where a bunch of my students could volunteer and work at Calvary Hospice Center, which was just around campus there. And there's wonderful stories that I include in the book from there about how, because their pain was managed and because they were not considered a burden and they were instead welcomed into the community and valued, that literally no one, if we believe the doctor who founded the institution, literally no one requested anything like physician assisted killing for precisely these reasons. And so I guess to answer your question, I get that it can be a space of intense meaning and a concern for people's suffering, but it needs to be redirected in a way that's consistent with the ends of medicine, with what it means to be nonviolent, with what it means to respect individual lives, what it means to say we are going to do everything we can to control your pain, but we're not going to say it's time for you to die now. Those practices have been put on display in so many contexts that I think it's fair to say you don't need to choose between having deep compassion for someone suffering. And again, you would have to be a psychopath to sort of look away and say, who cares? I don't think we need to choose between that and honoring the dignity of the human person.
Hmm. It's so like complicated, like what we're trying to touch on. And I have a follow up, but I'm not sure it's a question. Maybe it's just something I want to say out loud and just leave it in the space for people. But you mentioned public opinion. I think in Canada, it's like 80% or something of Canadians are supportive of keeping it legal although the number goes down dramatically when you're talking about, people with mental disabilities or, these other reasons for doing it that are not sort of imminent death or, uncontrollable pain. Those are those moments where, as you said, when people feel compassion, they say, okay, even if I might not choose it myself, or if I'm personally against it, I could foresee some absolutely extreme case where maybe there is nobody there for that person. They have nobody around, and that's a horrible problem that we have to deal with as a society and as individuals. But if that's a reality, if they have this uncontrollable pain, even if in a very rare circumstances the medications that are available are not able to actually totally control it, because medicine is and we think about it as a science, but every case is different and every case is uniquely complex, and some of these extreme ones we don't have answers to all of them. And then you have many people in our society who don't actually believe what we believe, right? They're not coming from a kind of Judeo-Christian moral ethic like we are, which your book lays out the arguments and is filled with that ethic from cover to cover, which is extremely helpful for giving people kind of a framework for understanding this. But the truth is that a lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people don't share those beliefs that we have. And so there's that element of it as well, that maybe they're in this situation, maybe they don't believe that, maybe the medicine is not capable. So in those absolutely extreme cases, you know I, I'm not advocating for medical assistance in dying, but I just want to understand and voice the complexity and the nuance and the reality of that. Pope Francis always said reality is greater than ideas, and that's a reality that we have to face when we're having this conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, you said a lot there to respond to. I guess I would also reiterate, in light of your second to last point, just how diverse, morally, politically, religiously diverse the opposition, at least in the United States, is to physician-assisted suicide, right? So from everyone in, deep blue, not everyone, but majorities of legislators in Connecticut and Illinois, to the very secular, again, American Medical Association, to the disability rights groups. So it would be hard, at least from my perspective, to imagine this as a kind of attempt of Catholics to shove down a particular point of view on somebody based on a esoteric religious position. Although you might say that human rights and human dignity itself is an esoteric religious position. I'd also say, and this is somewhat controversial, but I think in almost every circumstance, something like palliative sedation can be used. We can essentially palliate people to the extent they can't feel anything at all, right? And it doesn't kill them, but so in almost every circumstance that I can think of, palliative sedation is an option, where we're not aiming at their death. Uh, and, but those hard cases that you mentioned, I think, would fall under that. There are downsides to that. Like my friend who sent me the paper thinks that it's really important to be as aware as you can possibly be under the circumstances, to sort of face your death in a particular way and to say goodbye to people. Those are not unimportant circumstances, obviously. But then I also just go back to the two other points. One is, at least in Oregon and many other places, physical pain is not a primary reason why people request this. And if the American Medical Association is right that making this legal would fundamentally deform what it means to practice medicine, as I think, frankly, it already has in other countries, that's acknowledging the tough cases, and not brushing over them. But I think if you just sort of do the math on, like, are we going to fundamentally change medicine from an ends-based practice focused on health, focused on nonviolence, focused on saying it's good that vulnerable people exist, to a Burger King style medicine where everybody gets their way and it's just a transaction, like I have this skill that you have this resource and we can exchange in a marketplace for this, and undermine the very notion of what it means to have a coherent practice of medicine at all. um, you know I agree with this very secular American Medical Association on that one.
I'm wondering what solutions look like? The book is kind of a rallying call for Catholics and anyone who's against this to kind of get to work to make sure that we don't, at least the United States doesn't tip the way that Canada has gone. And you talk about the fact that, this is something that quote unquote pro-life Catholics and social justice Catholics can really unite on. So what does that work look like? What can bring people from different sides of the ideological spectrum together on this?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's something I care deeply about. I spent a good chunk of my career working on, mostly at the beginning of life, but especially since the pandemic, also now at the end of life. One of the things we haven't mentioned yet that I think is important to mention is that the Catholic definition, anyway, of euthanasia or assisted suicide is an act or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death. And a lot of the attention is focused on giving somebody, a drug cocktail that will kill them and they drink it and they die. But there's plenty of other examples of aiming at death by omission that don't get talked about nearly enough. And it's starting to get some purchase in the culture, especially, and this is another answer to the question you just asked me, Sebastian. It's on how vulnerable populations in the United States really distrust hospice in many contexts because they feel as if their family members are having their death aimed at by omission in those contexts, and a broader distrust of healthcare more broadly, especially for people of color who have good reason to distrust healthcare systems and whether or not they value their lives over the centuries. The history of what the United States healthcare systems have done to people of color, especially Black populations, is just a horror show. And that has filtered down throughout the generations, which led to distrust for good reason. In fact, and this has translated into distrust of physician-assisted killing. One of the most astonishing things I continue to find in New Jersey, which is, I think, 12 or 4, somewhere 12, 13, 14% Black. For 2 years in a row, exactly 0 people in New Jersey who are Black have requested physician-assisted killing, and this tends to play out over many different kinds of states and polities as well. It's the vulnerable populations that tend to be the ones that see this as coercive, see this as downplaying their lives, understanding they don't have autonomy and freedom, and they require resources which make them to be a burden on others, etc. And so, to answer the question that was asked me, as a setup to try to answer it, we need to be extremely careful that we don't just say no to assisted suicide or assisted killing. We need to say yes to supporting these populations in very particular ways, because in part because simply outlawing aggressive attacks on people's lives isn't going to do the deal, because this happens on the down low via omission all the time. And in particular, I think about dementia and populations with dementia as a particular focus here that can rally both, so-called pro-life conservatives and so-called social justice liberals to say, can we build a culture which says that every single human being, regardless of their ability to remember their name or tie their own shoes or live quote unquote independently, matters exactly the same, but that we help create families and institutions and communities, parishes, dioceses that orient themselves to doing precisely this, right? In the book, I sort of look at the future that someone with dementia may have in this country, and if they're speculating in an informed way, they may face a very, very difficult future. May be facing a future where they're isolated in a understaffed care home, which might be involve so-called robot care. I don't even know what that means. They're very likely going to be hopped up on some kind of antipsychotic drug to keep them more docile because precisely because they're understaffed. They don't have the kind of staff to care for them, which actually doubles their chance of death. The New York Times did an amazing expose on this a couple of years ago. It's just unbelievable. In my book, Losing Our Dignity, and also this book, I really call for a kind of all hands on deck approach to dementia care, because we're going to have the population of people with dementia double in the next 20 years and triple in the next 30. What will that look like? I mean, I really think we're on the verge of, if we follow Canada, especially, just saying, well, let's give these people the choice to kill themselves, right? If they face that future, that's anything but a free choice. That's a coerced choice, especially if they find that future is something that's likely for them to face. We need to get behind offering a different kind of future, one in which people with dementia are offered a life of a communal life with us, a life that says we're not only willing to bear your burdens, we're willing to do so joyfully and in a full-throated way that welcomes you as any other person in our community, instead of saying we can sort of understand why you'd want to kill yourself.
There's so much intersectionality here. Like, it has to be this multi-pronged approach, as you lay out in your book. And just, building off what you just said, a big chunk of your book too offers a kind of a spiritual analysis of the problem as well, along with some examples of lives of saints and monks who have, put death before, their eyes, maybe daily, even through their prayer practice or their way of life, not in order to, in some like, weird way, overly focus on death, but in order to live better, right? So I wonder if you could, maybe just moving into that spiritual realm a little bit, we could talk about, considering that, your analysis is that we've forgotten how to die well, or we no longer know how to die well, what it means to sort of, put death before us in order to live well.
Yeah, it is a spiritual thing. I mean, Catholics get a lot of flack for not taking Jesus seriously or the scriptures seriously, right? But if we do take Jesus and scriptures seriously, he had a lot to say about this question, right? That you know neither the day nor the hour. Don't build up these barns for yourself, right? Treasure in heaven.
My favorite is anxiety won't extend, another day to your life. I can't remember the exact quote, right?
Yeah.
But don't worry so much. And think of how sort of epidemic anxiety is in our culture today.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. In some ways, that's the purchase, right? That's almost the currency. Like, how can you get people anxious enough to keep scrolling on their phones and make money off their attention? The kinds of monks and saints that I engage in the book lead a different kind of life. They have death, not in some weird way, but definitely at the forefront of their lives, and it gives their lives a different kind of meaning than people who simply push death off to the side, as our culture does. We have just as we have a paradoxical relationship with suicide in our culture, we have a paradoxical relationship with death, don't we? It's one of the more interesting aspects of this that I found in researching the book, and maybe you knew this already, but I didn't. I never really thought about what the phrase funeral parlor meant. Like, what is the parlor part of this? But the parlor originally was the room in the house where the dead body would be laid out of your family member, who would then be visited by the community. In fact, this was such a common and important practice. They would have sort of people who would come help you arrange, as their profession, help you arrange the parlor for the viewing of the body, as your friends and relatives and community members came. That culture is aware of death in a way that we're just not, real death in a way that we're just not. And these saints and these monks are aware of death in a way that we're just not. And as a result, they don't really feel this need to control it, to try to control it. Imagine that because death, of course, is the ultimate reminder that autonomy is an illusion, self-sufficiency is an illusion, the fact that we don't require others is an illusion, the claim that we don't require others is an illusion. Death is a reminder that that's all nonsense. And so many of the saints really emphasize that being aware of death is a gift in a way. It's an evil that Christ defeated, of course, but it's also a paradox in this way. It's also something St. Francis, in his Canticle of the Creatures, which I learned through research of this book, didn't know was written over time. It wasn't written all at once. The last part he wrote was when he was faced with his own death, and he talks about welcoming Sister Death, praising God for Sister Death. and how he does use language like from whom no living man can escape. So it's not a necessarily good thing, but he praises God in a way for sister death. Now, how can that possibly be? In a way that it makes no sense in our current culture to do that. But if it gets to this point about that you mentioned about spirituality, like the kind of spirituality that has death up front just gives life a different kind of meaning. And it also helps us understand, most importantly of all, I think, with regard to this set of issues, that we're just not in control, and that leading a life like this is ultimately not up to us, but it's up to God. It just has profound spiritual consequences that have come up most importantly in the saints and monks and holy religious women that are an important part of our tradition.
Well, that's a good place to transition to our final question that we ask all of our guests, which is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
I think it would be a sister whose name I don't want to give because I don't have permission to give her name. But it's a sister who's an LA Carmelite who I met at a talk I gave out in Los Angeles, and she was an important voice, confidant, editor as I went through writing this book. And she would describe the ways that she and her colleagues would literally surround people in their dying moments and kiss their head and hands and feet as they entered their dying processes, and just honor them in a way that is so profound and beautiful and old, very old. Like the Carmelites, as I show in the book, have been doing this for a very long time, and so many orders of Catholic women religious have been at the forefront of helping people die well, but also live well. And that's why I would want this person to be canonized too, is because she and others were deeply committed to their residents living well as a way to dying well, and living well in community, where, again, much like the residents of Calvary Hospice Center, they were welcomed as full members and participants of the local community. So they would go out and tend the gardens together outside, and they would go to the sacraments and masses together. And in something that I think might be in the spirit of this podcast, they would have something called Vespers and Vino together, being real, full members of a community in a way that honored the goodness of their lives in the way that the pro-life movement can and should and does, but also not just in a sense of, well, every life is made in the image and likeness of God, yes, but what about that life's participation in the community and welcome into the community? And so for the sisters to be able to do that for the centuries they've done since St. Teresa set them on this path, I think it's so beautiful. And this particular woman, who, again, I hope you don't mind me, I haven't got permission to use her name, but I would love to see her canonized.
Saint Sister Anonymous Carmelite. I mean, we're talking about Jesuit spirituality all the time on this podcast in particular, Ashley and Zach do. But you do talk about Saint Teresa of Avila in the book as one of these examples of a saint to learn how to sort of face death, but also live well in that way. But Carmelite spirituality, I mean, is so rich as well. So if people get your book, it's a good introduction to understanding your anonymous saint a little bit better.
Thank you for that plug at the end. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And again, the book is Living and Dying Well, a Catholic Plan for Resisting Physician-Assisted Killing. Thank you so much for joining us, Charlie.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Jesuitical is made by us, Will Gualtieri, Kevin Christopher Robles, and Adam Buckmuller. Faith formation provided by Father Eric Sundrup, S.J. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, or like the show on your favorite platforms. You can support Jesuitical by subscribing to America Magazine at americamagazine.org. I'm Ashley McKinless. We'll see you next week.